Happy New Year! And it's time to pull this timing belt off. First thing I did is I set the motor at TDC, which this little guy goes straight up, and then all of these line up. If you were reusing a timing belt after taking something off, I strongly recommend marking, like with a paint pen, a little mark there and a little mark there, and so on and so on. That way, when you take it off, you put it back on, you get it on the right cogs the first time. You'll see in a minute when I put a new belt on that new belts automatically have such things on them specifically to help you put them in. But the first thing we're going to do is basically you take this guy off and then you pull the tensioner off, and then the whole belt comes off, and then we're going to inspect all the components. I don't necessarily want to replace everything unless I have to. If I have to, I definitely will. Timing components are one of those things that if they fail bad. It is a Japanese tensioner, but it does, doesn't, I don't know, it doesn't really look like it's leaking. So I think the tensioner is probably okay. It looks friggin' brand new, like, to be totally honest. And that little guy looks brand new also, but I noticed kind of, I don't know, it kind of wiggles back and forth. So we'll see. Like, it looks like this timing service was probably done fairly shortly before the motor was left to sit, but then, you know, hard rubber timing belt just sits over time and it just gets gross. Then the corrosion on that pulley. So we're definitely going to replace this guy for sure. The rest of them we'll see. So let me start by zipping that off and then go from there. Got my sockets and oops. Oh, I didn't put my pin in the back there. Let me find my pin. Put my pin. All right, pin is in the engine stand, so now to stop. There we go. So crack that guy loose. Go ahead and just get that. Put that little friend off there. This is the small idler. And this is actually one of the highest failure points on timing belt systems. It seems like on the Subarus, the ones that Gates sends of these are kind of junky. This one actually feels pretty good. Like I said, I think it wasn't super old. There's a little bit of wear on it, but it feels, the bearing feels good in it. So now we just gotta pull the rest of these timing components off, and then the belt, basically just the tensioner off, and the belt will just kind of leave. I believe if I take this guy off as well, it makes life super simple. Now, more than likely, there will be some cam spring back. I don't have any spark plugs in it, so it can rotate freely, but there is going to be some preload on the cams just from them sitting for a long time. Or not from them sitting, just because there's preload on them. Oops, I'm moving here. We're doing this one-handed once again. I always forget to grab my little camera holder until it's too late. Oh yeah, the other thing, this one has, on one side, it has the little guide, and it has the one in the middle. And then it does not have the one over there. Depending on what motor, what generation, and what year, they have more or less of those timing guides. Some of them have them on all the corners. I think that's the automatic transmission cars, for whatever reason, get more of them than the manual transmission stuff. Almost off. Tensioner's out. There's a little washer on the back side of that tensioner. It likes to jump off when you're taking them out. Okay, now let me just grab a little guy to scoot. Yeah, I'll have to probably scoot that. Well, I can probably make that work without taking it off. But let me grab some tens. Take that off. One, two, because you'll never get the timing belt on with this thing. That's the whole purpose of it, is if for some reason the timing belt was about to skip, so it was binding up, that would, in theory, prevent it from jumping off the crank. What's interesting is, like, when you look at what has the best coverage for the belt, the crank sprocket has almost the worst coverage for the belt. The cams, I mean, they get a full 90 degrees plus a little, 90 plus a little, you know, so it's like a quarter of the teeth there goes. So this cam's probably going to jump back. Oh, not too bad. Get the old belt off. All right, so old belt's off. Now we want to kind of feel the water pump. Water pump feels good. This pulley, so you hear that? That's terrible. We don't want that pulley on there anymore. So looks like we are going to buy the full kit that comes with all of them. Because even if you just have to buy one, like, that's the difference in price on the kit. These other guys I think were pretty good. Yeah, that one feels pretty good. This one feels pretty good. Oh, that one's pretty loud. So we'll get the kit that comes with everything. Tensioner feels good. Like I said, I think the tensioner was just replaced. My guess is they replaced the tensioner in this one and the belt when they did it. So let me pull that guy off and we'll go get a belt kit. Call it good. Hopefully the belt kit comes with a cogged pulley. If it doesn't come with the cogged pulley, I think it does. If it doesn't come with this pulley, then what I'm going to do is just buy that one and reuse this tensioner, because like I said, it feels good, and it's the good Japan one. It's got a little bit of oil in it, but other than that, it looks good. And rock that. So there's a motor without its timing belt. But now that it's off, the next step is actually not going to be to put it back on, but I'm going to pull the cams out. This is the side that the cover's on. So I'm going to take this cover off. I'm going to take the exhaust manifold back off. I only put it on with 2 bolts just for a temporary thing, just to look pretty. But I'm going to go ahead and take these cams out and put new head studs on this thing. So I pulled this valve cover off and found the source of much of the silicone that had been on the factory pickup on this. Whoever put this valve cover on siliconed the entire valve cover. Let me just give you a little pro tip here. They even siliconed the galley seals. If you have to silicone your valve cover, it's because you didn't put it on right. This half moon is broken. See that? Where did all the pieces go? That's the question. Those are things that are frustrating. This, if you use a new gasket, and specifically the thing that most people forget is these little grommets which go on the bolts on the valve cover gasket. So let's grab a valve cover here. So these little grommets go on each of these, and if these are all hard and old, which these ones are, when you tighten it down, you're not going to get the proper amount of torque on the bolt because the bolts are shouldered. See that? So this is only going to tighten down, and it's actually going to torque against the shoulder. And if you have a worn out grommet, what ends up happening is that shoulder protrudes just a little bit too far, and your valve cover never gets truly tight. So now, because some Japanese guy decided to silicone everything, I'm going to have to go in and de-silicone all of it, which is a nuisance. A little bit of solvent and a Scotch-Brite pad works pretty good, but you got to try to not get any into the motor, or else on first startup it's going to suck all that silicone through. It's another reason why after you start an engine, even if it's used, it's not new, you should always run it to operating temperature and then dump the oil. There's just so much stuff that can potentially contaminate that oil. If you even go drive it at all, you risk opening the bypass on the oil filter and having all that silicone just get spread everywhere through the motor. So, like I said, just run it to operating temperature. Should be enough to get most of what's in there to end up in the filter, and then change that filter. So I got it all pulled apart, took the cam gears off, didn't record that. I will record the next one so you guys can see some methods. Really important when you're taking these off that you keep them, the cam cap has to go back in its correct location. Luckily on Subarus they label them pretty well, so left intake, and then they actually stamp on there the 2, which tells you that's cylinder 2, and then this is cylinder 4. Same thing, cylinder 4 exhaust, cylinder 2 exhaust, and then the cam seal cap. So it's pretty easy to get them back on in the right spot. I even put the bolts on in the same spot when I take them out. It probably doesn't matter as much, but you just want to make sure that these go back correctly. If you don't put them back correctly, what happens is this journal here has worn in a pattern to that, and you can actually see this has had a little bit of wear. May have been ran low on oil at some point, but it doesn't look too bad. There's no major scarring, and that's what's super important. So I'm going to get all these pulled off and then take the cams out, and then we can see how to get the head bolts out, and then the head will come off. Real quick, I'd forgotten that this was all part of one piece, so you have to disconnect this oil line as well. So when I did, I saw inside there is a screen. Now normally on the US motors, the only ones of these that have a screen also have a little bump on the top. But apparently in Japan land, they put the screens in them when they didn't have the bump. So here this is, here's this little screen. You can't really see it in there. We're going to try to get that out. See if I can get it out without damaging it. It's easy to take them out by destroying them. It's pretty hard to take them out in one piece, but I want to get it out and show you guys what it is. Come on. Oh, interesting. This one is like part of the bolt. Well, I'm probably just going to end up replacing this bolt with one that doesn't have a screen, because it looks like it's actually been infused into the bolt plastically. This plastic here. I don't know if it's glued in or if it just happens to be in there, but it looks a little more difficult to pull out than the US ones. But interesting because it doesn't have the dot, but yet it still has a screen. You don't want these. The idea is to keep debris from getting into your AVCS cam journals. The problem is you get debris in here and then they get clogged up, and then you don't have any oil to your cam, and you end up losing cams, losing cam gears, all kinds of problems. You can lose turbochargers this way. It's bad news. The next super important thing to check for is bucket wear, and these buckets look like they are in super minty shape. Now just like those cam caps, the buckets need to come out and go back in the same place. Each one is uniquely ground to the valve that's underneath it so that they're an exact correct height, and that's how the valve lash in these is adjusted. These don't have shims like previous, or I guess different Subaru applications. I'll have to get a magnet to get those out, but we want to take them out and put them back in exactly the same position. Alright, sorry about the jets overhead. You can see they're uniquely numbered on the inside. That I believe has to do with the grind of them, and they grind off that little stem in there, and that's kind of how they get their height, and that combined with that guy right there is your overall height of your valve to the cam. And so if you need another thousandth or a couple thousandths of an inch, if it's too tight, you have to grind this more on the inside. If it's too loose, you have to get one that hasn't been ground as much. But you can't really grind that very well. There are some places that can, but typically you end up having to buy new of these, and the total cost on a set of these, they're not very expensive when you buy one, but the fact that you need 16 of them, it adds up quick. And it's one of those things when you're building cylinder heads on these Subarus where you suddenly end up hundreds of dollars deep in just extra parts that were needed. So that's why, like I said, it's super important they go back in to the factory locations. When you're doing aftermarket cams, if you just drop the cam in, you hope that it's lashed right. If it's not, then it gets expensive quick. When we install aftermarket cams here at the shop, you're going to get new buckets every single time, because we're going to measure them every single time, because we want to set them up perfect, and that seems to prevent pretty common bucket failure on aftermarket cams. Now I'm still going to run these factory cams, so I don't need to worry about it, and it's all going back into the same head, so it's not going to be an issue. But we got to make sure that when these come out that they get put back in the exact same position they came out. So we're going to put them in order that way. So that was the exhaust valve number 2, and then this one, and so on. And then we'll do the same thing for the intake. That way they go back in correctly. If someone comes in and knocks this thing loose, you get to stab them in the eye with a screwdriver. That's just general practice. So there you go. All right, and since I have decided I'm taking this head off so that we can put new studs in and new gaskets, I had to undo the intake manifold. Obviously, it was holding on. The exhaust manifold obviously would have held on to this head. I've got a gasket still. Undid that bolt as well, and now we can undo these head studs. All right, so now all the bolts are off, and now we just have to lift the head off. Oops, what are we still stuck on? Did we forget something? Nope. There's a couple little dowel pins in the head. Ooh, I'm glad we did this head gasket. That's why we did it. So this is a cylinder head, Subaru cylinder head. We're not going to, you never want to set them flat this way, so we're going to set it flat this way. I'm going to put a towel down and then set it over here on this other bench, at least for now. Alright, so this is why I said it's a good thing we redid it. You can see it was starting to try to push a little bit down there on the bottom, just the exhaust side. It definitely wasn't blown, but there it is. This is the 207, which unlike the US 2-liter, the 207 has a semi-closed deck. See, the US 2-liter, these are open. And so being that it's semi-closed deck, has a lot better sealing surface. And you can see right there again, a little bit on that gasket. It's trying to give. So it's a good thing we decided to do these. That would have been probably not long. I mean, it would have made some power for a little while, but it probably wouldn't have lasted super long. There's those pistons, those Japanese pistons. Those are pretty cool. 2-liter. Got a little bit of dish, but they're pretty flat top. They're not like the US 2-liter ones that look like a weird square. Little valve reliefs. Pretty badass motor when it comes down to it. So that's why we chose this one, because it's pretty badass. A lot thicker cylinder walls. See how thick that is compared to the US 2-liters or the US 2.5 liters. This has a huge cut there, and then on the exhaust side, notice there's no cuts. So there's only a cut on the intake side. That's nice. And just barely, just the tiniest little bit of a cut there. If it does crack, it will crack there, but far less likely to crack. Much better sealing surface, semi-closed deck. It's a cool motor. When it comes to taking off these cam gears, there's some pretty trick special tools. First thing we got to do on the AVCS motors is take off the cap that covers bolt. A couple little guys with little 8mm heads, and comes off his little O-ring seal in there. You want to make sure that's good and clean and that the O-ring is in good shape when that goes back together. So now we have, it's a 10mm, let's see there, and these are notorious for being impossible to undo. Now if I put an impact and just hit it, the cam would just spin like crazy, which probably wouldn't be an issue because these, I don't believe this motor is interference piston to valve, but if the pistons were at top dead center and the valves went down on a lot of motors, the valve could hit the piston and do damage. I know Subaru engines are interference, but it's usually valve to valve, so it's intake and exhaust. If both sets of valves are at full extension, then they can smash together. So you want to make sure that both cams are loose. That way there's none of the valves are open right now. So I need some way to hold this gear. Now they make a special tool, some pretty sweet tools. I think a Company 34 is the name of the company that makes them. And you can use those tools if you have them, but if you don't, what you can use to get a good grip on this cam, some cams and other types of cars have a good nut you can grab onto. These kind of do. You could potentially put a big wrench on that, but then you're putting a lot of stress on the cam. All of the torque that you're going to put on there goes directly to the cam. So what I like to do instead is just grab, oh look, this has a tension, this does have the bracket on the bottom. I did notice on the other side the head's already off, but I did notice on the other side that it had the bracket as well on the bottom, just not on the top. So what you can do here is what you're trying to do is keep this from going, we're going to be coming this direction with it. So you want to be able to make sure that you can hold that stable. Now both cams are going to move together, but it should hold pretty good. Now I'm going to try to give this a shot with my electric impact. I kind of doubt it's going to work, and I'm going to show you why in a second. This is a snap-on big gun, but even though it's a snap-on big gun, the amount of torque required to break this loose is astronomical. You can see it's not going anywhere. And I wanted to show that for a couple of reasons. First reason, this is a 10 mil. It's got an adapter because this is for a 3/8 drive, not a half drive. Sorry about that. Had a quick little interruption. But basically, you need a lot of torque, and the reason for that, when I get this bolt off, I'll show you. Now this is still going to be a pain because it's jumping back and forth, and even with an air gun, it's still got a lot of chatter, and so it loses a lot of its torque. There it goes. All right, let's do this other one. I want to leave that on. I don't want to take that all the way off. We'll go ahead and see if we can get this other one. There it goes. All right, the reason why these are so hard to undo and why they seem to be put on with absolute glue even when they're torqued to spec, you can see it on the bottom of this. You see how, see that wear mark there? What that is that's actually what's holding in surface tension the entire outside of this edge of the head of this bolt, the flange of this bolt. Now if this had a normal washer that spun, you wouldn't really have all of that extra torque on it because you would only have the head of the actual bolt on the washer creating basically friction. But instead you've got the entire flange, this huge flange, and you're trying to transmit all of your torque from your tool over this tiny little 10 millimeter Allen. So it's just not an ideal situation. If you're outside the car, it's not too hard usually, but in the car, these can be an absolute nightmare. So anyway, that's how you take those off. They are different. You can see one's longer than the other. I don't know why it won't focus. You want to make sure they go back correct. If you put them back the wrong way, you're going to have a bad day. So I'm going to go ahead and get this cam out just like the other one and get this head off, and we'll be done pulling the heads on this motor. And there we have a bare EJ207 block. Well, it's not bare, but it's missing its heads. That's all we have for today. The next video, we're going to take those heads and we're going to do some fun stuff to them before they go back on. Something most of you probably haven't seen before, which is always cool to show you guys some new stuff. So, yep, that's the heart. These pistons look pretty good. This one, yeah. A little bit of gunk in there. We'll have to go and clean some of that out. I think that came off the head when I dropped it. When I pulled it, some stuff just kind of fell in, but we'll get it all cleaned out, get it oiled up, good to go.